I just wanted to give a short intro to this episode before it gets started because it's slightly different than a normal unsupervised thinking episode. So this episode is a joint one between us and the Always Already podcast, so it's going to be posted in both of our feeds. The Always Already podcast is a critical theory podcast, which, if you're not familiar, critical theory is a branch of philosophy that deals with analyzing and critiquing different aspects of culture and literature to kind of get at the forces that shape those things in a way that may not be obvious. So it's a bit of an interesting podcast for us to do. It was Connor's idea to do it because he listens to Always Already, and so in the episode he explains his motivations for wanting to do this joint podcast. We read for this episode a book called Brainstorm by Rebecca Jordan-Young. Rebecca Jordan-Young, she has a PhD in sociomedicine, I think is the term, and so she's kind of in between pure scientist and this meta critique of science that comes out of philosophy and the humanities, especially a field called science and technology studies. So this book is meant to be somewhere in between us, Unsupervised Thinking, and Always Already, and it covers a lot of specific detail about certain scientific experiments related to how hormones in the womb can affect gendered behavior of a person later in life. And so in the book, she goes into quite extensive detail about certain studies and the flaws in those studies that perhaps make this theory that prenatal hormones impact gendered behavior later in life. It's meant to weaken that theory and make it clear that the evidence isn't as strong as perhaps some people think. To be honest, we don't talk too extensively about the science in this episode, and so we may very well have just a regular unsupervised thinking episode about gender and biology or sex differences in the brain at some point. But this episode actually, interestingly, focuses more on meta issues of science and how it relates to society, and it's based in this book that we all read, because obviously gender issues and the study of gender can have a lot of impacts on society. So I think it leads to an interesting conversation about those more meta issues. Just a technical note, this episode is a little bit longer than usual because there were 6 of us all talking, and so it's about an hour and a half, and it was recorded via Skype, so apologies in advance for occasional suboptimal sound quality, but I think it's all still totally fine. So on to the episode.
Hello and welcome to a very special joint episode of the Always Already podcast and Unsupervised Thinking. For the Always Already audience, Unsupervised Thinking is a podcast that's run by a group of computational neuroscientists. We focus on neuroscience and artificial intelligence and other aspects of science more broadly. I'm Grace. My co-hosts are
Josh,
Connor,
and hello, Unsupervised Thinking folks. My name is John McMahon, one of the co-hosts of the Always Already podcast, which is a critical theory podcast that spends part of our time talking about texts new and old in critical theory, and the other part of our time doing interviews with scholars, activists, artists, practitioners who are in some ways putting critical theory into practice. And 2 of my co-hosts on the podcast are here with us today.
Emily.
Hi.
Oh, wait, we did it at the same time. Darn. We're really bad at this. I'm Emily.
Hi, and I'm James.
All right, so Grace, maybe you can kind of set up a little bit about the overlap between us and kind of what we're all going to be thinking about going forward.
Yeah, so for this, we all read this book called Brainstorm by Rebecca Jordan-Young, and it's a book that tackles issues related to biology and gender and the interplay between them, and I assume we'll get into more of the details about that interplay. But I kind of wanted to put Connor on the spot because he set up this joint podcast, and to have him explain his motivations for this, which may seem like an unconventional pairing.
Oh, great. Yeah. I like to read philosophy, I guess, as do many people. And I guess I have a feeling often doing science that there's a sort of, I mean, maybe this is totally ungrounded, but it's kind of the way I think about that, and this is a very unoriginal thought actually, but that fields are like divided up kind of too much. And I find myself, which is a common complaint of PhD students, hyper focusing on certain things. And I just thought it would be cool to try to, because I like the Always Already podcast quite a lot, it would be cool to reach out and find something that we could talk about where we just kind of actively, in our own tiny way, bridge some kind of gap. That was basically my thinking.
This book works really well for that, and it turns out we've talked about a lot in our conversation leading up to this that actually those gaps are very much a subject of the book, if not core to its aims.
Yeah, which maybe raises kind of an interesting question we might start with, and that is thinking how kind of all of us from our various perspectives and kind of investments in different sort of academic theories, approaches, methods, whatever, kind of how we made sense of or evaluated her positioning or her methodology or her kind of rhetorical strategies that she's engaged in. Perhaps to set that up a little bit, we might kind of highlight a couple quick passages from the introduction from the first chapter. And so she says that on page 10, throughout this book, I examine scientists' methods in conducting brain organization research in a way that can be seen as a hybrid between the kind of critique that is the model for scientific peer review and the kind of critique that is more common in science and technology studies. Later on page 11, she writes, while I did not physically observe scientists in their work, I did interview them. And some of these interviews turned into ongoing collegial conversations. Still, I did these interviews as another scientist, a sort of critical insider, rather than taking a more anthropological approach. And then finally, on page 12, she writes, I'm trained as a scientist, and I value scientific method. I believe it is worth holding scientific research, especially high-profile research, on a topic that is of great social and political importance to the highest standards. So, all of you, how did you kind of make sense of her positioning herself as a kind of quasi-insider or quasi-scientist, and then the implications of that positioning for the work that she does in the book?
Yeah, so for me as a scientist, I had never heard of the field science and technology studies, and kind of it seemed like the framing for her was to set it up to say that she is closer to science and has this science training, but the idea that you would need to set that up kind of gives a signal that she's not fully immersed in science or working as a scientist. To me, I read it as there was a clear sense that she kind of straddles fields and is interested in meta critiques around science in addition to the details of the science itself.
Yeah, it's interesting for me because from my training, my side comes out of anthropological theory and social theory, and looking at the kind of ethnographic side of it and critical theory, of course. And so she kind of disaffiliated herself from STS studies, which would be like the closest, camp or something that I would affiliate with, and kind of reading her as like one of us or reading someone else. And I actually was joking with John yesterday, and I told him that I felt like I had wandered to a different high school clique's lunch table reading this book, because I was like, she's not one of us. And she, she positioned herself in my reading like she was not in the critical theory side of things, or the kind of anthropological theory or ethnographic practices. And so it's interesting that you all kind of had that similar, reception. Where has she positioned herself? Like, where is she then? And this book is kind of in a field of its own?
Yeah, I think the book is a unique thing in that it includes a lot of detail of scientific study and an investigation of different methods that are used in science in like a kind of fine-grained way, but yet there's still this, at least to me as I read it, kind of an overall sense that this wasn't exactly science. There was some either different motive or different positioning of things that made it seem like this wasn't just about science, but something bigger.
I mean, so sort of, for example, like the term brain organization science that she uses.
We might need to, I'm sorry, but we might need to back up a bit to just say exactly what it is.
Sure.
Subfield of science that she is framing and writing about.
Yeah. So, I was going to try to do this, but probably not as comprehensively as we should. So, I mean, basically the book focuses on the study of sexual development, implicating hormones in sexual dimorphism and sort of later in life gender-related traits and dimorphism. And so sort of under this, within science, this is sort of a heterogeneous field that's maybe emerged over the last, at least predominantly, like since the 1950s or so, in terms of the body of literature that she's heavily relying on. And she does something so there are certain like kind of things that get triggered as you read this, like looking at it as a scientist, that make it feel kind of not like a scientist. The fact that she tries to sort of taxonomize a certain kind of science that's thematically connected, that she's interested in analyzing, but not using terms that those scientists themselves have employed, is something somewhat non-standard for scientific review.
Read the passage where she introduces the term that she uses, which is brain organization research. So she's referring to kind of a general theory about gender development that she came across in the scientific literature, and she says, according to this theory, prenatal hormone exposures cause sexual differentiation of the brain. That is, early hormones create permanent masculine or feminine patterns of desire, personality, temperament, and cognition. Further hormones later in life could activate behavioral predispositions, but the predispositions themselves result from the initial organizing effect of hormones very early in development before birth. Intrigued, I began to look for other research related to this theory, which some scientists call the organization activation hypothesis, and some call the neurohormonal theory. I was particularly interested in studies that explore the earlier organizing role of hormones, the time when hormones presumably cause sex-type predispositions. I think the clearest way to refer to that work is by the term brain organization research, so that is the term I use in this book. But it's not the term, like she acknowledges that that's not a term that's used by scientists.
What page is that on?
That's in the preface, on page 6 of the preface. Sorry, page 11. I'm bad at Roman numerals.
Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh so much at that. We're all bad at Roman numerals, probably. I think that's an interesting point that you raised, that, or sort of highlighting that term is not one that is sort of out there, that it was a term that she used to sort of bring a bunch of stuff together and claim that it was... that there were some shared stakes to looking at this as a whole set of research. Because one of the things that I was thinking of in response to the question John raised about, how do I make sense of the way this book is positioned vis-a-vis my own, academic inclinations? I think one of the questions that arises for me regarding that is what the audience is, which is something that I wasn't sure was so clear, because I think what she's trying to do is to say that the social study of science is not the same kind of study of science as what we might think of as a scientific way to study science. So I got the sense that she was trying to come up with a scientific way to study science, but to position the stakes of that in the realm of science and technology studies. So she frames the project as like ultimately trying to discover to what extent gender is related to the body, which has been a question that has been, of central concern to feminist thinkers and philosophers for, 100 years, right? And I think that there's that kind of tension maybe between like something we might think of as a scientific study of science versus like a social study of science might be kind of where the positioning, some of where that sort of outsiderness feeling generates.
So where do you think she falls in that?
I'm not sure. I think she's trying to do both. I think she wants to say there's a scientific way to study science, but that there are stakes for doing that are important for like social theory and philosophy, maybe.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a kind of similar reaction, I would say. And I think that it probably points to some fairly important things about the tensions around this issue somehow. And I think she's doing some kind of social exercise in a way where she's attempting to, I don't know what, I'm speculating, but maybe she's attempting to please multiple people. Maybe she's attempting to be seen as legitimate from multiple points of view. She's in some way trying to differentiate herself along lines that are driven by kind of perceived flaws in different approaches. So there's certainly the stereotype that scientists will kind of it's a stereotype that scientists will, I'm not sure that I agree with it, will be dismissive of social studies of their own practice or something like this. So presumably she wants to be kind of on the inside there and to kind of use the correct methodology from that point of view so that she'll be heard or something. And that seems reasonable to me. I think it can be kind of easy to dismiss attempts to critique science from the outside. I'm sympathetic to the idea that that's a problem, and I'm sympathetic to the idea that there should be critique of science. At the same time, I'm also sympathetic to the kind of view that a lot of the critique is not that good or something, which is, in a sense, these are the kinds of thoughts that are actually
You mean in the book or like in general?
I mean in general, sorry, yeah. Somehow in the world. I mean, these kinds of things, maybe I don't know, I'd be interested to know if people think that my attitude to this is not kind of coherent or something, but these are the kind of concerns that, in a way, like make me want to like do a podcast episode like this, for example. It seems the divisions kind of seem not that important in a deep theoretical way, but maybe in some social way they are or something. I'm not sure.
Can I just respond to that really quickly? I think that there's a kind of interesting way that, as somebody who comes from STS vaguely, and sort of philosophy of science background, is that I think one of the like key reasons why people want to do a social study of science is something that scientists would actually, I think it's an implicit thing that scientists would already agree with, that it just like people who are not scientists feel the need to elaborate this because of the thing I was mentioning earlier, that there's like a gap between the actual dynamic and very diverse processes of scientific research itself, and then the way science gets deployed and sort of talked about, in politics and in just the world in general. And what science and technology studies, I think, tries to do is to say that, like, right, we have like rampant critiques of politics and the political institutions and figures that anyone can make, on Twitter or on Reddit, and that's like maybe not so good for democracy, maybe good for democracy. Like, we have not figured out yet what that critique has allowed or precluded, but like that the main thrust of science and technology studies is to point out that science is dynamic and diverse, and it has, it interacts with the people's lives who are practicing it and the, particular context of the things that are being observed, and that, like, which I think most scientists would say, like, duh, but we have the way that we talk about science as a thing that is different than what it actually looks like. I don't know if that's helpful, but
yeah, I mean, I was excited at the prospect of reading this book and having it actually be kind of a new take on science, just to hear those kinds of thoughts, not even about this particular topic of gender and biology and that kind of thing, but just a general, something to read on that. In this particular book, I don't think that's what it turned out to be. It seemed to be more about, like, a lot of the criticisms that she makes are totally in line with what scientists would say to other scientists about their work.
So speaking just for a moment more on the methodology, right? I mean, it feels like she is trying to engage with the scientific literature, and rather than sort of try to analyze the social implications of the work per se, she's focusing on why the scientific work itself is not necessarily totally coherent, or why there are flaws in a lot of the scientific research. So it does feel from that perspective, though sort of like the framing of the book feels to me like something that I would expect more from STS or something. The sort of the detailed investigation of the science seems to be trying to like pick at the science in a sort of science critical kind of way, like internal to science kind of way. And I guess that's why maybe it's appropriate that she terms herself as an insider of sorts, because it does feel like a sort of a more nuanced criticism of the actual detailed science. Not that STS critiques aren't nuanced, but that this science she's sort of criticizing as science, not necessarily for the ways that it plays into society.
Which is probably
Right,
in part
I think-
kind of a rhetorical move, right? Because she probably assumes that folks like Emily and James and I are more or less on her side, so to speak. And my assumption would be she probably expects a more difficult or more challenging or harsher read from
scientists,
right, and those who would understand themselves as scientists, right? So
I have
there's kind of two
another
questions there, which is like how then effective that that attempt by her is. So that
I knew you were going to say that.
And then also, like, what do we think she is trying to say back to feminist theorists or to STS people, or to, like, if we set up a line between like the critical theory side and the science side, you know, we've talked more about going from the what is she trying to say to scientists, but I think there's also a little bit of what is she trying to say to those other groups of people about science and about perhaps their own misunderstandings or misperceptions of science, right? Because I don't think she just wants us to like me to uncritically be like, yeah, we need these feminists to go study science. But I think he also wants to say something back to me as well.
Right.
I have a question. Yeah, I have a question for the scientist about another like heuristic that she made up. So she, on page 19, she's talking about, the studies that she's looking at, she calls it the quasi-experimental network. But that this network, her definition of a network in this case is not one where, like, you know, scientists that are actually in talks with each other, or maybe like went to the same university to get their training or whatnot, and are coming out with the same kind of models. This is a different kind of network, and she's bridging a network of scientists who may not even be in discourse with each other, but that she says they're all working on the same theory. And so because they all share the same theory, they're differentiated and diverse researchers are still all needing to kind of like check themselves against the theory that they're all working on, which gives her the kind of organizational premise to make them a network. Do you think is that a valid way to do the kind of critical work she's doing? Because I guess like what you're saying, that she's trying to do this, a critique of science from within science. And,
well, it's pseudo within, right? I mean, like I don't know. The style kind of vaguely resembles science, but there are ways that it doesn't resemble the critiques within science. And I think you've pointed on like one of the ways that it feels kind of not the same way that scientists tend, like, run of the mill to critique their own science, right? Most scientists are criticized by people who publish in similar venues, attend similar conferences, or sort of self-identify as working on similar research directions. And at least that's my read of the situation. And she's kind of doing something slightly non-standard in trying to, both retrospectively and kind of even given the contemporary landscape, piece together a set of researchers that might not see themselves as doing something similar, but that she sees as doing something similar, which it seems like something legitimate to do, but does feel maybe a bit different from the way like run-of-the-mill science actually operates.
I mean, yeah, I agree that that's true. And I think, but to answer James's question, I feel like I would want, so if your question is kind of, is it a, how did you phrase it exactly?
I guess like, is all of these, right, well, is this heuristic valid in that, is her kind of premise that because all these different research agendas are operating under the same theory, or working to prove the same theory, that gives her a way to kind of measure them against each other? And like, she's doing a translation work of terms, but like, is there something that, is that true, that like all theory, like all researchers that come out of the same theory need to kind of have a coherence or something?
Well, maybe I would say, like, I don't know what's valid or not really, but my intuition about this would be that I like it, kind of, from the point of view, you know, like, who is it? Quine or something has this thing about regimented theory, you know, this kind of process of going back over, of philosophers say, going back over science. This is my understanding of this idea, going back over science in a way that is kind of even finer than scientists need to do themselves during their scientific practice. So there's a question of like, what do scientists do? What do they even need to do in order to do decent science? And then there's a question of, can we kind of take, how does the science that gets produced in this kind of turbulent way, in a turbulent and ongoing way, get turned into cleaner knowledge or something, or kind of more useful knowledge or more coherent knowledge. So looking at it from that kind of point of view, I think at an abstract level, I very much like the idea of people going in and trying to state that certain kind of, domains of research are related and should bear on each other. And you could even imagine then that, if there was a good kind of feedback cycle, you could even imagine that work like that would then influence people in the different domains that have been connected, say.
Yeah,
in the
and
next
actually,
round.
just to interject, I mean, pragmatically, it actually feels like, and I think this is kind of sad, that it's almost funding agencies that do this work practically in the contemporary science world.
Funding agencies?
Yeah. Like they come up with programs where they say, hey, we think that this is a direction science should move. And people from essentially non-communicating subfields of science might realign what they view as their field based on who the changing dynamics of who funds who.
I strongly agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is
actually, can I just make? Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I mean just so again in a sort of aspirational way, right? Like the way I think this should work actually would be that, and maybe I'm getting off topic here, but would be that like the feedback doesn't have to be just within scientists. First of all, I think there should be more feedback from science itself, like a kind of high level, scientists-driven process of looking at and doing this kind of linking up. But I think it would be really cool if, for example, there was some mechanism built into the structure of science whereby, scientists and maybe other people who have more diverse views, like say the author of the book, right, or whoever, can kind of participate in these type of feedback cycles and say, oh, well, where are we trying to go? Like, what do we know so far? And it would be like not necessarily that like, divisive, and certainly not driven by, kind of this top-down funding agency thing. I don't know. This, I think, is an important part of how science kind of works. And it somehow doesn't seem currently very kind of coherent, or like it's been thought about much explicitly how to like manage that process.
There are
maybe I have too much of a Soviet attitude to it or something. I don't know.
I'll just note that there are a lot of proposals that come out of the feminist and post-colonial study of science that argue for exactly what you've just suggested, that like there's a way you could do science in a more sort of, or with a more diverse setting, that it builds in mechanisms of self-reflection that could in many cases like overcome some of the things we might think of as a problem of translation, like back into society or back into how do you frame it, like neat or coherent knowledges or something like that. But that's just a flag.
I think it's just, maybe we're beating a dead horse a bit here, but to her point of why she kind of eschewed the methods of ethnography in doing this, that focuses on what scientists do in the field, and like, and kind of almost treating the field as this kind of exotic place, and you go in that way and catalog it and all, but that doesn't actually get to if the science is being done well according to the theoretical premises of the science, that you need someone who actually knows scientific theory, can do that work from the inside. And so I guess if that is a need, then like she is emerging to bridge this gap. How well did she do it? That's then the next question.
There are some things in science that exist for this similar purpose. I mean, people write review articles that are meant to summarize the state of a certain field. So there are review articles that are written on the topics that she covers in this book. So that's why it was a little confusing to me as to how to think of her and her place and her mission, because in some ways it seemed like a very long, drawn-out review article, but it also seemed like it had kind of an agenda in a certain way, and it was just unclear to me what that was. So I guess in terms of it being a review article, I would say it wasn't a very good one. But then to evaluate it by some other measure, I don't know.
Yeah,
I think it was a good review article of one very specific, I guess getting too far ahead now, but one very specific sort of field, and it was kind of pitched as a review of something more general, which is the question that, Emily, you sort of suggested was really the interesting question, right? That the age-old question kind of, maybe not age-old, but old, and the link between the body and gender, say. And I think she pitched bluntly. I think she kind of pitched it as attempting to answer that question, and then I think she sort of reviewed literature that bore on a more specific.
It was a very comprehensive and detailed review of a subset of hormonal, hormonal developmental kind of science.
Yeah, but I guess
maybe we should step.
Yeah, so maybe we should actually talk a bit about some of the content of the book and things that we thought were,
or whatever people want to do.
Yeah. Oh, you mean, I think we should just like keep going on this like meta train about what is science. That is my general that's my one of my tics and peculiarities. So.
I actually did have one question relating to what we were just talking about in response to the question John raised earlier about what we think she's trying to say back to people who are sort of on the critical theory side. Like, do we think that she's trying to give us an answer about the relationship between gender and the body that like feminists would not be happy with, or like where do we think she lands on that question vis-a-vis our critical theory people?
I mean, I did think a lot about this in one sense, which is not going to answer your question directly, but hopefully it says something that pertains to it, which is I got the feeling in this that like when I was reading it, that there was a view that was like politically fashionable or not, and that the science, being true or not, pertained to that, like the acceptability of the sort of political implications of what would happen. And I wasn't sure how to parse that. Like somehow I was reading it and like, well, if the scientists are right, does that mean it's like bad for feminism? Or if the scientists are wrong? It wasn't clear for me if there was some sort of tone to this. My temperament would be like, we should just let the science speak for itself, and we should have values that if they're in conflict with some scientific finding, we still, we still can promote sort of a political agenda that's value driven in society. But there was something about this book that kind of was, I felt as reading it that like I had to be on guard almost as to whether or not there was a conflict between some truth in science.
And what would be the politically ideal state? Like, what would be best to be true?
It would be nice if something were true, because that might be politically convenient. But, like, I don't know, if the scientists... Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear you guys on this.
It's interesting because I kind of... And we didn't read the entire... We read the preface, chapter 1, and chapters 8 through 10. So we did skip, like, the middle. But I almost felt like the urgency of the political and social issues that she's like commenting on, but not. I didn't feel like she was actually writing for those urgencies in a way that like a critical theorist would center the political problem that these kinds of different realms of scientific discourse and practice or interpretation or something, and how it shows up in like policy and whatnot. And she seemed to like, because she positions that like the political stakes are high here, but then she doesn't really, I feel like, address them for my person, for what would count as addressing the political stakes. But I didn't get it.
But I do think there's a lot of like offhanded moments where she does, right? Like on page 267, wait, let me find it. She writes, my problem with the sex in the brain theory is that it underplays and mislocates the creative sources of human difference. I mean, that's like a political claim to me in a way.
No, yeah, that's definitely a political claim. Yeah, I'm thinking more, I guess, like policy, but that's definitely a political claim.
Well, I mean, she does say at several different points, more especially near the end, that like, well, that's ultimately a political and moral question that has to like be figured out later. She does say that at a couple different points, even as she is doing what Emily just pointed out of highlighting these kind of points that I think many of us would call political throughout, whether it's the point that Emily highlighted, whether it's the, what she accuses some of the scientists that study CAH for not paying attention to the kind of psychological effects of these interventions and surgeries and treatments themselves. And so I think there are several places where she's trying to make smaller political interventions, but she wants to defer the larger political questions that the book raises. That's kind of how I read it.
Right. I guess I agree with that. Maybe this is being a little picky, but you mentioned where she said moral and political questions, and the word moral actually stood out to me as kind of odd that she chose moral instead of ethical. because I just feel like
Oh, interesting.
political ethics is like the parlance, and to call it a moral question just felt very like I hear moral theory in like analytical philosophy or some kind of. It didn't seem like it was coming out of I don't know who uses the word moral within critical theory. I hear ethics all the time.
Okay,
so I don't know if that's a big difference or not, but it
is.
It seemed interesting to note that she uses a different word.
So you say
to
this
signal to us, right?
Exactly. No, this is a signal. There are signals on both, like in both respects. Like for scientists reading this book, there are those kinds of subtle indicators that, like, yeah, this isn't quite a scientist critiquing the science. There are too many maybe political injections. Not too many. I mean, I'm using too many in the sort of statistical sense. Like normally when I read science stuff, it doesn't have that many. Not in like a imperative sense, but there are like too many political messaging, and there's too much redefinition of the field of analysis, that like the field of study that she's covering. So it's interesting that sort of you saw subtle things that said like, yeah, this isn't someone from my sort of intellectual background writing this.
Right. And I guess like I definitely agree that she has those little moments of intervention, but like if your intervention, like, I guess it's just, what are you centering? She doesn't want to center the intervention per se on the political, ethical / moral question. She wants to center the intervention on the scientific, theoretical practice and like lining up your theories and checking them. But yeah,
one might read as a kind of another sort of rhetorical strategy, right? Like if it's already, to use Josh's word, like too much in some way for science to have the small interventions where she does, then it would perhaps lose her audience credibility or something if there was more, if that was more overt, no?
I agree with that.
I mean, I'm definitely this is a difficult task if you're trying to write to this like Venn diagram middle overlap audience of scientists and critical theory people and STS people. But so, I mean, I'm not gonna sit here and say that what she did was easy, but I wonder in some way that, when you run to the middle, do you lose your base, right? In either way, does she have a base of people who are with her the whole time through?
I hope that doesn't happen for this podcast episode.
Stay with us, all listeners. We will be back by ourselves next time.
Back in our comfortable bubbles.
Right. I don't know. To me, it felt like a rhetorical strategy. I felt like basically the program was going to be something along the lines of, I trust science. When I figure out how all this science works actually and reveal what claims about socially or politically important matters it does or does not support, then it will be kind of self-evident which of those claims that want to be based on science, right? So, I say, the difference in, gender differences in occupations are supported by science. She wants to kind of reveal the truth of the science. What does the science really support? And then it'll be kind of like clear which of those claims are, debunked or not. That kind of seemed like her attempted.
With her attempt being to essentially, and I'm not trying to indicate that I'm against this, but with her attempt being to sort of debunk all of the gender-based claims about contemporary society, which is probably quite warranted based on an analysis of literature.
I'm not sure if she was trying to debunk all of the gender-based claims. I mean,
she was pretty strong, actually. Right?
She does repeatedly sort of say, like, there definitely are differences between whatever. I mean, points.
Where do they come from, though? Do they come from hormones? And her claim is essentially that hormones, I mean, I don't want to over-summarize it, but, like, to me, a takeaway from the book was that, like, hormones aren't responsible for any of the differences.
No.
I think the claim was that the evidence is confusing and it's not clear that it does. Not just that it doesn't, full stop, but that it's not clear that it does based on these sets of studies or
that's
data.
Fair. Yeah, that's
but also it wasn't even, it was so, in my mind, kind of strangely specific. It was prenatal hormone exposure relating to lifelong permanent differences.
So yeah, this emphasis on critical periods early in life where the hormone exposure during that time period is not responsible for lifelong differences.
Because she's not, there are studies that she talks about, or situations that she talks about, where hormones will be manipulated later in life, and she doesn't really bring up those aspects of it, or the people who think that those are the hormones that matter and that kind of thing. So it is a very specific theory that she is trying to kind of make people not grasp so tightly. Just say, like, this is not as certain as maybe some people think it is. I don't even know how certain everyone thought it was, but she's kind of putting forth the idea that people thought prenatal hormone exposure led to gender differences. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't.
That to me seems like it was incredible to me to realize that really was the literature that she was reviewing, because I was like, oh my God, this is going to be great. I'm going to read this book and get a really thorough overview from someone who is like socially and politically thoughtful of a scientific literature that bears on a kind of topic that is of social and political importance currently. And I was excited about that. And then I was like, wait, she's just telling me that the literature on whether or not hormone exposures prenatally has effects on like high level cognitive, psychological, social kind of behavioral outcomes later in life is unclear.
And actually, no, more
it's shocking to me that anybody would claim that that's clear.
Yeah.
So if that's true, that scientists are going around, if there are scientists going around being like, oh, it's clear that, whatever like high level differences later in life are due to these difference in hormone exposures, to me that just seems very unlikely a priori to be clear right now, even if there is some tiny there's some small effects that we could, just because it's such a hard question. I don't know. Yeah.
And most of it was her focus was in humans, so she didn't even really go into the majority of the work done on this kind of topic is done in animals, because it's a much more controlled setting. So this was, does this happen in humans, which is just an incredibly specific thing that, yeah, like no one should claim with any certainty.
But I think the problem again is not that like scientists all claim that with, relative 90% certainty, but that, the anecdote at the beginning that like parents will, a boy pushes a girl on the playground and they say boys will be boys, and there's scientific evidence that proves that hormones matter, and like we don't think, a layperson doesn't think beyond that, and then you don't need to think critically about how you subtly raise your boy child and your girl child differently because you think that like the hormones are doing the bulk of the work anyway. And then I don't know, I think that's part of the reason why we're still trying to figure out like where is this book being pitched, because there are ways that claim, that clear link between hormonal development and gender performance, like seems in some offhanded ways to be like settled and obvious,
Well, and maybe this is kind of a source of the dissatisfaction that Connor was expressing, and that maybe in this, and also another way to get at what is the political intervention question, is that another level on which this book is operating is not just to take this, what you all have, clearly articulated, is this very kind of small, perhaps slightly absurd claim, and pick that claim apart. But she's also then interested in, as Emily points out, how do popular understandings, bad or not, of the science that gets done impact expectations, attitudes, behaviors, norms about gender, right? So there's kind of the, perhaps where she understands herself, or I don't want to say understands herself, where, and from my perspective, the book is less concerned in that aspect or that dimension about the engagement with science, but about what happens when science, to use James's term, translates back into kind of popular discourses about gender, which is a really, really, really difficult task to do all of those things and speak to the science in a way that is going to be especially satisfying.
Yeah.
I actually kind of see it slightly different. I don't know. Because I feel like...
How dare you disagree?
But
I thought we were going to like do a united front against the science.
Part of the problem, John. Part of the
just
problem.
Just kidding.
Exactly. So no, okay. I was thinking when I was reading this, and like maybe this is a way to bridge into giving some specific examples from the text, so that way the listeners know exactly what she's doing. But so that example on like the playground that you brought up, Emily, or like those kinds of examples that she kind of peppers throughout the beginning of how our notions of like dimorphic sex and differentiated behaviors that line up towards masculine and feminine and whatnot, that in and of itself is kind of the meta structure by which we are then scientists are then performing their research into. So like she was questioning the pre-hormonal therapy, not because it was like there was this already implied assumption that there is a masculine and a feminine or something that like so like it's the positivism, I guess, of not realizing that what appears as masculine and feminine and in a duality, maybe it's not a duality in the first place. And so then looking for hormones, right, like having hormones already being like associated as sexualizing or something, right? Like why are you even thinking that they do that? It's because you have this dimorphic model already in place that then causes you to look at things as like, what are they doing towards masculinity or towards femininity?
Right.
I think another question that she brings up that kind of is like, she is definitely interested in the cultural social spaces of this, but how it bounces back into science is when she was going through the studies of sex type behaviors and then dealing with toys and the categories that scientists use for different toys that make some toys masculine and some toys feminine. I think that is a point at which it's not so much like what people in the playground think toys belong, but like the scientists that are saying these toys are also masculine. How are they coming to that being a masculine trait in a toy? That is the social cultural construction that is like hidden behind the scenes because no scientist is born and lives in a vacuum, right? But they are also coming of age and being articulated and interpolated as sexed and gendered subjects. And so you're always already being stuck in the middle of all this.
Right, which like it's like a tautology, right? Like I know this boy exhibits masculine characteristics because he plays with a toy that I as a man consider masculine.
Mm-hmm. Right, this is the like, it's all very self-reflective, these categories. Which is like, and before in this pre-setup we were talking, and that's what I was saying, like these kinds of like, this is like I'm not trying to sound pedantic or like I'm looking down on science, but like coming from the critical theory side and understanding.
Yes, you are a little bit.
Here we go. But like the whole sweep of semiotics from structuralism into post-structuralism, and that post-structuralism is not a refutation of structuralism, but it is an elaboration of the more dynamic processes of structure. But we are still very much structured in post-structuralism. That looking to the construction of a category of masculine and feminine is the very first premise that I would think of.
Wait, so are you saying that we need a quantum theory of sex difference?
I'm not quite sure.
That was a joke. That was a bad joke.
No, but I think like that's the only metaphor that is within science that is incorporating the same dynamics of structure that post-structuralism was trying to get at.
Can you elaborate?
One point before this, though. I mean, again, we had talked about this before, that it shouldn't be a thing that, like, oh, scientists all believe this. There's one dude who decides to categorize some things for the purposes of an experiment as masculine or feminine. This is one person who's doing this particular scientific experiment, right? And that specific person is attempting to quantify something in a way that is acceptable as a scientific methodology. But
weren't there like manuals or like guides that scientists were using?
Well, so the issue is that, so she brings up this idea, like in the beginning when she's setting things up, that you need to be comparing the same thing across studies. And so sometimes scientists are good at that, and sometimes they're less good, which is something that she kind of points out a lot, that different studies are comparing different things. But in an effort to be consistent, people will use whatever measures the person that came before them used, or the scientist. Yeah. And so given that it seems like, I was kind of surprised by how, standard, at least the ones she lists, I don't know what other options there are that different scientists are using, but she does say that a lot of these measures are kind of just, they stem from stereotypes, and they were made up quite some time ago.
By some scientists many decades ago.
Yeah, and so there's a pressure on scientists. Obviously, you want to use measures that make sense, but you also want your studies, to fit into the previous studies. So if you want to measure, like, how does gender change over time, you have to use the same study that they use or the same measure that they used in the 60s and compare it to something today.
One example is the child behavior checklist, and she has a citation for it. There's another one is the perceived competence scale for children. And so this is what I'm saying. Whoever's making these up, here's another one. Recall childhood gender questionnaire. And so, like, it seems, and I don't know the inside of science, right? Are those kinds of manuals just being used within different studies as, like, the definition for and feminine?
I have no idea.
And it carries across multiple studies in a way that no one is double checking the construction of those very categories once it's already in literature.
I don't think that there's a question of no one double checking them. It's a question of each scientist, in a very decentralized way, chooses which definitions and manuals to rely on, or none. Mm-hmm. And so to say that, like, this is like a thing that scientists now believe is, I think, very not consistent with the way that scientists view it. Mm-hmm. There might be a subfield. So, like, and it could even be geographically or sort of ideologically or culturally isolated, where you have a whole bunch of people at a certain kind of place. I mean, there are people who deny climate change based on only citing people from a small subset of universities where there's a few professors who all deny climate change.
Yeah.
So to say that,
and
like,
all those people are going to be representatives in our democracy. Sorry.
Right. Yeah, right.
But so the view that, like, these guys who make the manuals set the tone for science, I think, is just not realistic. There are huge fractures, and people only cite the previous work that they think is informative or useful for them to build upon. So yes, you could.
But science is
isn't
monolithic.
That kind of the problem
problem
in some way, though? Like,
that is a problem.
Like, the decentralization of it is the problem. If one of those manuals has just a completely ridiculous, culturally relative definition of masculine, and then it gets, like, replicated in 10 other studies, that no one is tracking, right?
Well, what would be the solution?
Hold up.
She's trying to be the solution, I suppose, right? They're going through all of them and saying, look at these various these 10 manuals that all these other studies are drawing from, and all of those definitions seem to be not quite, they're not objective, right? And I think that's what she's trying to do. Whether or not she's doing that well is a secondary question, but I do think in that she's concerned about the social, cultural side that spills back into science. That's what I was trying, like, not so much that where STS wants to see how these discourses roll out into other realms of discourse. She's looking to see how culture and social condition, sociocultural, relative, local context are built into some of those studies, like, but she's cherry picking, or she's making her own network, of course, right? Because it is so decentralized. But I think part of that is the problem that she's trying to point at.
Yeah. I think that's definitely, like, sorry, Grace, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I agree that, like, this idea that these measures are just kind of out of the heads of people who lived in a certain time and had certain assumptions, like, that itself is not scientific. That is not a scientific way to define something. You should go out and observe what actual differences are and categorize things that way, not just, like, assert what you think differences are. The issue I have is I based on how she represented other things in this book, and because none of us are in this field directly, I don't know if she's accurately representing the measures that people use.
I mean, it does
I guess that's hard to measure. There was one study that she noted that was different in that the researchers actually observed children playing with the toys themselves and then used that as their kind of, like, the phenomenal grounding of whatever category they're trying to use. But yeah, I guess none of us are in this field, and no one is in her field but her. So it's very difficult to actually, like, be able to verify what she's saying.
Can I make one small statement, which I think is just that, right, how you are viewing science and the results of science from different points of view is somehow, like, really important. So within science, say, like, again, it's kind of ridiculous for me to say within science, because it's kind of like, in what sense am I within something that is related to physics? Like, it's like, like, my field is as far away from theoretical physics as it is from, going and painting houses. Like, it's just maybe not quite that far, but it's very kind of unrelated in certain ways. Anyway, my point is, like, given this kind of fracturing, if from the within, say I'm in the kind of domain of studying gender and the brain or something, and there's like 3 fields, that's 3 sub kind of cliques or something. It's never this clean, right? But say we're all kind of in our sub cliques citing each other or something, and we're kind of coming to different types of conclusions. And then I can look at the other cliques and be like, oh, you guys suck because like you're doing all this kind of stuff that I think is wrong. And then people on the outside can look and say, here are the things that science thinks about this topic. How does it end up being that, clique number 1 has more influence or something?
Yeah, that's such an
it could be
interesting
that,
question.
Yeah, like is clique 1 just loud, or is there some historical process that leads to that?
So yeah,
how do disagreements within science get ignored or suppressed or exaggerated?
If I just add to this, right? I mean, if there's like a bigoted clique of scientists, right, and there's like a liberal clique of scientists whose science just in both cases reinforces the biases that they hold, right? I mean, then people can selectively cite like
whoever
people in
agrees
policy.
with them.
Yeah, exactly. So you have some liberal scientist in New York who decides that they're going to do a study that they believe, when designing the study, will show something that they think is politically convenient for them. And you have some, very bigoted scientist somewhere else who designs a study that's like shows that there's like extraordinary from birth, sex differentiation or something like this. And, people like see the science that they think is relevant. And
I like that your dichotomy is liberal or bigoted.
Yeah,
Yeah, very
and
telling.
from New York
And
or
exposing a
sexist.
bias of its
Yeah,
own.
that was hilarious.
It's interesting to go back to Connor's question, because it goes back to a comment you all made earlier, so it goes back to a comment you made earlier about the funding structures and funding bodies and funding institutions, right? Because they are necessarily going to play an important role in selecting which of these 3 hypothetical cliques is going to have some kind of prominence or some kind of hegemony as well, right?
Absolutely.
For sure.
I don't know. I haven't really tried to look at this. If the funding lines up with the narrative that occurs in popular science, I think there's a way for people to kind of make it a priority of theirs, and there are some scientists who do this, to kind of seek out media attention. And so even if they're not actually getting a lot of praise from their
So you could have like a bad
scientists,
scientist who does
a
this.
rogue scientist going off and telling newspapers things that most scientists wouldn't agree with. So I wonder how it actually lines up. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the extreme version of that probably doesn't happen that much, where it's like a real rogue. Although, yeah, maybe Breitbart or something is like, plucking out the nutcases. But I think, that's definitely a kind of a somewhat independent variable, which is like scientists' personal will to be heard and have social influence. So.
I want to go back to something from a long time ago. We were talking about, this idea of like, scientists are kind of assuming that at least in some sense, like there are two genders, and we're going to compare males and females and that kind of thing. And perhaps looking at behavioral data, that might not be so obvious, because things do happen on a continuum. Like there's a lot of overlap in different skills and that kind of things between different between males and females and all of that. And so it might not, like, the idea that there's this assumption that there should be a dichotomy it seems maybe false from the behavioral perspective. But I think that when you're studying the biological basis of gender, there's obviously a dichotomy in genetics, because there's XX versus XY. And
But
so I
there's
think
also
that it's
at least
not
3 other chromosomal arrangements that are not XX or XY. This is
yes,
like
but the vast
classic,
majority.
the classic
Well, but,
Fausto
also-
Serling. Sure, yeah,
but,
no. I'm just
Well, no, actually, this would be. I mean, this is worth arguing about, because in the background of this whole discussion is that, I mean, I think we all come with different assumptions about what reasonable parts of this are. I mean, from a scientific standpoint, I don't mean like that in a normative sense, but like there is the perspective that non-typical chromosomal arrangements lead to sterility, so they are somehow distinct and represent a disorder compared to typical arrangements of chromosomes.
right.
See, but wouldn't that almost be a kind of background, implicit heteronormativity bias that...
Well, it's not heteronormative because it says nothing about orientation, right?
It's an evolutionary
Or
bias,
just-
though, right?
Yeah, it comes
Right,
because
it's evolutionary bias.
yeah, but biology is much of the understanding of biology is based in evolution, and so yes, that's where
So
you
this,
get
like,
information
will to live
from.
or something is embedded in, like, the... You know, they're saying, like, the need to reproduce across generations or something becomes the orientation for how we will like chart those various chromosomal arrangements.
And it's just, at least it's, so if it is the case that there are, like, most people fall into XX or XY, and they have reproductive kind of abilities related to them, it just makes sense that there will be perhaps other biological differences that relate to XX versus XY, and so that's a reasonable place to start your study from. I think that's kind of the intuition behind it.
I think that makes sense. I did think, though, that one of the sort of political stakes that was not enumerated in this book was she several times kind of offhandedly refers to parts of, like, stories of evolutionary psychology as sort of like myths, you know? I think that one of her kind of unstated, maybe another kind of straw man is that she thinks that the sort of stories that evolutionary psychology or biology tell us are maybe, like, overstated as well. But I thought that was an interesting one that she lets kind of like fly under without saying anything more about.
This might be attached to that then, actually, because I have a question about this evolutionary, because it was coming up a lot. And I'm thinking out loud now, I've not thought about this reading it up until now, but is it Jose Munoz, the queer theorist, who talks about like queerness as death?
Yeah.
And like non-reproduction? So I'm just curious, like if you were to...
No, that's Lee Edelman.
Oh, right.
Okay, Lee Edelman. So, right, like that kind of, you know, the whole notion of evolutionary biology is reproduction. And like, what if that is not, you know, instead of normalizing reproduction, I'm not trying to decenter it or maybe like claim that clearly it's a significant part of this, but that to kind of decenter it and to say that all of these other biological expressions are, you know, legitimate.
But I think the point that Grace was making is not that I liked the way you just framed it as like, because there is that one difference that we know about between XX and XY, we can assume that there may be others, so that's a place to start. I don't think that making that claim automatically ties you to the view that like reproduction is the central feature of human existence. You know what I mean? Like, I guess like it's just one measurable difference that we can see. So why not track other things that we might be able to see or measure onto it? I'm just thinking about this for the first time right now too.
Difference? Is that like the meta difference that all of the differences are able
No, so I mean,
or could you start the difference, like start your whole line of questioning from a different difference,
right?
And see what you get.
So I think that's a valid point, is to look at the set of differences that you could compare and make distinctions upon. But I think, and I mean, so I'll try to push also towards something, I mean, that came up in this book, right? There's a notion, and I will come back to this, at least in spirit, I think what a core part of this is, that there's this notion of interactionism versus like additivity of hormones versus experience, where, you know, you might have like the notion that like the claim was that fundamentally when scientists look at hormones versus environment, they're looking at just like a sort of linear combination of these two factors, whereas they could be looking at like how when hormones drive some change in behavior, that change in behavior drives changes in hormones, and how there's like actually a lot of complex dynamics going on here. And I think something that as a scientist people take for granted is like you have to latch on to whatever the sort of biggest first order differences are that you can see, so that you can start making any progress, right? It's like, I think something that's hard for scientists is to I mean, basically you want to start somewhere, and you have to pick very easy problems to start with. And because you want to quantify them and try to make very clear and quantified statements about them. And of course, you're interested in building that theory up and moving to increasingly complicated and nuanced versions of it. That's, I mean, I think most scientists do feel that way, actually. But the difficulty is in making initial steps that you can make progress on that are actually productive from the standpoint of ultimately leading to increased nuance. And so for something like hormones versus environment, or, you know, broad differences in people, you might look to the simplest differences you can see. hormones do something kind of most of the time, environment does something kind of most of the time, or this gender does something kind of most of the time, this other gender does something kind of most of the time. And kind of in the long run, that is almost certainly going to be an impoverished view of reality. But maybe it gets you off the ground, at least gets a discussion rolling that otherwise wouldn't have gotten started. And maybe you could say like, oh no, the discussion is totally foolish from the outset. But I think the way scientists tend to think about it is like, you need to start somewhere. This is somewhere where I can quantify something. Maybe let's proceed from there.
Yeah. I will say though, to now I'm just like arguing everyone's view. To James' point, I think that is that because sex difference has always been so core to a lot of like really restrictive and perverse like political projects, that particular question and that particular starting point is one that people are interested in like maybe seeking an alternative to. I mean, have you guys ever read Emily Martin's The Sperm and the Egg?
Nope.
It's really awesome book. She's an anthropologist, and she does an anthropology of like biology textbooks where she tracks the language that they use to describe what the egg does and what the sperm does. And it's really funny because they describe women's like periods and uteruses as like waste and like refuse and all, and that like every time you have a period, basically, because the thing that the egg is good for is production, every time you have a period it's a failure of production. So women's processes are considered as failures, and then they use all this like amazing language to describe sperm. It's like really funny. It's a funny book, but like
are wet dream failures?
No. They're amazing feats of production because they produce millions of potentials. So they're like these like things to be held up and admired, you know. That's just like one sort of silly example, but I think that's the concern.
There's a part in the
right?
book that talks about the first time sperm were looked at under a microscope and all of the kind of values that were attached to them as like adventurous. And,
right. Yeah. Like exploring. Like,
yeah.
It's so weird.
Like little colonists. It's all
what's our positive like proposal for how we can, have input into the scientific process around these things?
I thought you wanted us to positively describe eggs to make up for.
Oh, or we could do that. Yeah, that's fun.
Well, you can start by having all of the people in your grad programs listen to this episode.
Nice.
This
good,
podcast.
Good marketing, James. I like it.
That's a start right there.
Is it marketing if it's within the episode? I don't know.
That's a good question.
That's a great question.
That's true.
I think we have to
very-
get
It's
some
verification.
think
If you are
tanks to
listening,
fund
you are
us. And
thoughtful, smart person. You've made a good choice if you've gotten this far in the podcast. So. This is like a little commercial break to like just keep it going.
Connor, do you have an answer to your question?
It's kind of obvious what my answer is, isn't it?
No,
it's really blandly something like we all have to talk to each other more. And no, actually, I don't think that's not my answer. Do I have an answer? No.
Yeah, I guess it's something that I kind of, like, I'm interested in science communication, but I'm also, like, I'm a scientist and I do science, and in some ways I view them as just very separate things. It's like, there is science and there is truth, and the truth doesn't care about how it's talked about. Like, you just want to get at something that is accurate.
Oh, the post-structuralist would disagree with that claim.
Oh,
Of course, yeah, of course.
My heart started to bleed.
But then how do people choose to represent it? That's usually those decisions are made so far removed from the areas where the science is done that it's hard to connect.
I don't think they are. I mean, okay, so now I'm going to like etch away in a negative way to sort of, without giving my positive proposal, but like, I don't think it's true that the decisions are made very far away. I really want you guys to like disagree with me now and tell me why I'm wrong. But like, I do think it's wrong. Like that decisions are made very, very far away about how to, like the bloody vervet monkey study.
Yeah.
They literally gave the monkeys cars.
Yeah, okay.
And we're like, look.
Wait, but I have a strong feeling about this, which I've already stated, which is like, okay, science is not science is indifferent about what people are studying in some sense. It is unscientific in some sense, but that's a very particular usage of the word to say unscientific for them to say like, oh, it's masculine and feminine. The cars are masculine and the whatever are feminine.
I don't
Can you tell us
care
what
about
the
it being
vervet monkey study is?
right. Yeah, sorry. So she cited this study at some point. I can try and find the page that it's on if you want. But basically, it's at the end of one of the chapters we read where they try to do some non-human study to kind of claim that there are really low-level differences between sexually
Genders,
male and female, right? Like monkeys, as to preferences, So they gave male and female monkeys like toys to play with, like human-style toys to play with, like cars.
It just seems insane. Yeah,
It's ridiculous.
Which I think she was saying that study was, now maybe this is true or not, but was trying to show that the kind of dimorphism was was pre-humanoid evolutionarily already there. But then you're giving human
toys
things to them.
This is page 234 to 236.
But this is the thing, right?
John.
That those toys were essentially masculinized and feminized in such a way that what essentially made them masculine and feminine were like color and like these perceptual things or how it could be used.
But so this is exactly my point, which is that like there's some dude out there who thinks that, and so they do that study. And is it science? I don't really care about the definition of science as to whether we should call that unscientific or not.
It's science. It's weird, shitty science.
It's poorly motivated science. Fine. And for that to taint all of science is as ridiculous as if there was some really bad critical theorist who we could point to and make fun of because they said something stupid. And then we would say all of critical theory is bunk because there's some one dude in critical theory who said something, stupid. Right.
So these extremes are clear, and the question is, to what extent do things that are analogous to whoever it is that set up this study kind of being like, blindly being like, when a monkey plays with a car, it signals that,
It's
animals
masculine.
with penises like cars or something.
So it's interesting that another kind of a question on top of these that you all have laid out is, again, the translation back to popular science coverage, because if we go back and look at 234, the way that Jordan Young introduces the vervet monkey study is this. When sex-typed interests are mentioned in popular science coverage, it is now de rigueur to include a study that seems to show sex-typed toy preferences in a non-human primate, the vervet monkey. Jerry Ann Alexander and Melissa Himes, 2002, devised a study of toy preferences in vervet monkeys as a response to criticisms of brain organization studies. Right? So Jordan Young is interested in this case in how potentially, again, this question we've talked about before, how bad science, quote unquote, seems to sometimes be the most popularly covered.
Yeah, that detail that she came to this because it's what's commonly said in popular science. I didn't notice that, but I mean, I do see how the most kind of salacious things can become the most talked about. That's true in basically all domains, and it's unfortunate.
But I think scientists need to have more, like, okay, so Josh, you're kind of saying the point, right, is that you do science and a lot of it is always going to be crap, and all reasonable science know that.
Many fields is crap.
Yeah, a lot of all fields are crappy, right? And there's always going to be these, and I think it's like definitely the case that there's going to be these weird, strange biases. I mean, strange from some point of view, right? In the future, we'll look back and be like, what the hell? Why were they doing that, right? Like, it's clearly because of all these social factors, right? And in some sense, you can't fix that problem. You can't get rid of it. It's impossible to, like, optimize it and totally cleanse any field of human kind of inquiry or intellectual practice.
Yeah, this is my concern. Yes.
But I think we definitely don't take the position. No one could reasonably take the position that, we throw up our hands and ignore it, right? I mean, of course, right?
No, I agree. Yeah.
Of course. So I think like scientists, and I actually would go so far as to say that it is my experience that in science currently, there is definitely a lack of some kind of vigorous internal reflection especially about those issues that are considered politically important, maybe. Although scientists are sensitive to all these kind of PC, like, oh, we have to be afraid of this, afraid of that thing, but it somehow just feels like they don't really care, and it's kind of reasonable that they don't care because the ways that they're criticized are not that interesting. There's some kind of missing.
I think you're overgeneralizing. It's hard for me to believe that scientists, more than other professionals, care or more or less introspective.
I'm not saying they care more or less. I'm saying that it matters a lot if they care or not, maybe.
I mean, it would be nice if lawyers and doctors and various professionals all cared about what they did with a level of sort of self-reflectiveness. And I think they should, right? I mean, of course, that's my perspective. But I don't think that scientists are... I don't think that they're more culpable than any field that has any sort of social or political relevance, which is like, I would say most like white-collar jobs have some social or political relevance. And it's not clear to me that scientists are scientists seem to think about their work as much as anyone else does, which is not adequate.
I agree with you.
Yeah, I'm fine criticizing it, but like the criticism should be kind of measured and like appropriate to the level of the crime, which is like they're normal people doing.
I mean, I think the complication though is perhaps we might say that because science has a certain amount of cachet or currency, that if we can point to something and say science demonstrates this, that makes it more likely to be generally accepted as true.
A curious
you might
point.
say there's more of an obligation on scientists than
right,
lawyers.
To be careful about what they proclaim as true.
I
it's
agree
the
with that.
authority of the epistemology and the method and like where the discourse originates and power, right? These are like Foucauldian insights, I suppose.
Sure.
I
But I mean,
agree
I
with
think
that,
a really
though.
sorry.
Because so most jobs don't require that people have a lot of self-reflection or self-criticism, but the idea of science is that you have peer review and peer criticism, and so there is something built into science that is meant to make it more trustworthy, and so I can see why people would hear something that scientists say and not view it with the same skepticism that if like a lawyer said it.
I agree with that. And another point, okay, is that many scientists, and this is interesting in thinking about the current like political structure of, say, the US, I think. Many scientists are also not listened to, right? Like climate scientists are actively ignored, and there are attempts to like suppress in certain ways, what they say. So it's very curious to me so science as this, like you said, Grace, this, and as Emily said, right, this kind of practice or like social formation that is supposedly espousing the importance of kind of extreme criticism and kind of care. The fact that that is supposedly the value of science means that it can be used to back up various claims. No, so I think it's curious. It's like I don't think it's as simple as like science can be used, like science is used via the media to reinforce power structures or something, right? Because it's also ignored whenever it suits when it suits certain interests.
Totally.
And then it's probably obviously a lot more complicated than that. It's not that there's some 10 powerful elites who are just being like yes to this science, getting out no to that science. No, it's obviously not quite.
This is really interesting in light of what happened with the Weather Channel and Breitbart recently, just in a kind of general to the side discourse of science. And then I was wondering, because I don't know if people don't know the situation, the Weather Channel had this video that they released that talked about global temperatures dropping at the poles, I believe, about 1 degree Celsius or something, but that's like to be expected when you come off of a La Nina pattern into an El Nino. And so, yes, it's like this little drop of temperature, but on the top of a huge and continuous like spike since the 70s in global temperatures. Well, Breitbart takes this little clip and because no one at Breitbart probably even has the like scientific knowledge and skill set to even know that they're taking this out of context. Like, I don't think they're willful about it. I think they just don't even know what they're doing. And they post this up and they're like, look, global temperatures are dropping. Here's this video from the Weather Channel saying so. And the Weather Channel actually issued a blog, and the meteorologist who was in the video made another video, like going through the whole case and trying to set the context for this right. And it's just really interesting because, like you're saying, science in some ways these days in this country, in the United States at least, right, is becoming, in some ways, the power structure. It benefits to have scientific authority. In other ways now it doesn't. But then in this post-truth era, you even have just like completely misapplications of science now. And so I don't even know where we go from here.
Can I request an Emily Crandall consult on this question?
I knew you were going to do
is
that.
The one of us who studies the social and political and epistemological questions about climate change denial.
Oh, why? I have to go, after we hang up, I have to go, like, write so much of my dissertation. Don't tell anyone. I don't know why I said that on a recorded cast. That's not a good idea. What do you want me to talk about?
I mean, just respond to Connor or to Josh or to James or to Grace on these kind of questions about the perhaps like the epistemological and political questions about the use and misuse and disuse of science.
And can we we are in post-truth now, right? I don't want to be all Hegelian with my time periods and stuff, but we're in post-truth.
I don't know anything is where I'm at.
not in post-truth. I'll never be in post-truth.
See, that's it. But this is the problem, right? Like, you're in your ontology and other people are in theirs, and like there's no way to translate anymore. Using truth as a kind of guide that we're all looking for truth. I don't even know if that's the case.
So I mean, this is an interesting sort of. I think it's a direct. I mean, these kinds of conversations form the backdrop of any conversation across disciplines where people come with widely disparate assumptions, and I think, I mean, operationally, scientists believe that there are like. I think in order to do science, it's essentially pointless if you don't believe that there are things that are actually what you will find if you do the science well. Or, I mean, if you are totally comfortable, I mean, the only alternatives in the science space are you are comfortable in a sort of intentional way of interpreting things using, let's say, kind of quantitative methods to any conclusion, or you believe that there is like a right answer, and people have called that right answer historically truth, right? I mean, like they're like, if you think, hey, hormones have an effect on the body, right? And there is an effect on the body. It may be interactive with the environment, but there is an effect on the body. Then you have to believe that there's like a right answer.
But I think some questions pose bigger challenges than other questions. I mean, I think that's a really specific question, but I think one of the points of this book, to get back to our original task here, is to
very impressive, Emily.
So she poses the question, right, as like, to what extent gender is related to the body, but she's also trying to say that like part of the problem with the way that like these studies have been talked about in sort of popular media is that like the specific question that you're asking about the relationship between prenatal hormonal exposure and gendered interests later in life, what criteria do we use to measure whether that question and the answer to that question can then give us an answer to the question of to what extent gender is related to the body, right? So there's like a kind of, conceptual gaps, I think, and when we're looking at really complex, socio and environmental phenomena like climate change, the question is not like, I think one of the questions should be, in addition to like, why is it that we pay attention to science sometimes and not others? Like, there's a very simple answer to that question, which is kind of like an easy answer, which is like, well, because people have no incentive, right? But like, I think that's an uninteresting answer. And we should ask questions like, okay, but when we're trying to study something that's extremely complicated and that involves like all these different areas of theorizing and measuring and observation, like we have to also ask the meta question about like are we asking the right sub-questions? Like, are we asking the right smaller questions to break up into smaller ways that we have disciplinary mechanisms to sort of solve or to seek answers to, right? And I think that like meta interrogation of the relationship between the small parts of the question we're asking and the big problem we're trying to figure out is like an underdeveloped like area of thinking. And I think that's where that kind of like cross-disciplinary potential is really rich, that we like should talk to people in different disciplines to be like, how is the tiny question you're asking about this giant phenomena like relate to my tiny question? What can I learn in answering my question and looking at how you've answered yours, and vice versa. I don't know. That's a long
I really
answer.
agree
Sorry.
with that.
Yeah, and I think different aspects of science have different awareness of the gap between their tiny question and the big question. Even within neuroscience, there are fields where they kind of will talk about some larger question, but then it's clear that there's an awareness that is really far off from the study, whereas other parts of neuroscience just kind of roll over the fact that the tiny thing they're studying is only barely recognizable as the larger question.
But I do think that the incentives, I mean, you said like, oh, well, like people, I mean, you said it's an uninteresting answer. Yeah. I do think that is a large part of the answer.
Totally.
Right? I mean, so like if people are incentivized to believe something or not incentivized to believe something, or incentivized to strongly put something forth. So like by that, I mean like, if you do science, like, I mean, I think this actually has affected science. There are scientists, like that is to say, professors at universities who do science, who have, I think, twisted what they do in order for it to be more compelling to the media, right? I mean, like if you do a certain study and you think, I'm going to avoid saying any kinds of studies fall into this category specifically, but like if there are people who I believe
don't name any names.
I'm not naming any names, right? But do studies.
If you want, you can chat us the names, since we don't. Doesn't matter what random scientists think of us. So like that's enough.
But these people will do studies which essentially they believe the media will pick up on more likely, that like they're gearing it for like personal clout, right? They think the New York Times is likely to write some piece on this or something, so they're more excited about it. And I think that
like you and I, Josh, have joked about this, right?
In what sense?
With one project that we were doing, remember?
Oh yeah.
I remember we were like, oh yeah, this is totally the kind of shit that the New York Times is writing about.
But there's also like,
I shouldn't have revealed that. We can edit that part out.
Whatever. There's also like the specter of neoliberalism here, which if you listen to our podcast, is a popular ghost we like to hang out with. But like one of the problems is not just like, okay, so one of the reasons why I say that the answer that it's not incentivized is uninteresting is because I also don't want to use the language of incentivization, because I don't want to say that like people will only do things when they're incentivized because now I'm a good neoliberal, like yeah.
They've managed to make it that way though.
Right. And that's one of the problems. I think that like that's one of the problems that is like a truth about, lower T, scare quotes truth or truth, whatever you want to say, a truth about our current world that like we have to figure out how to parse, and that like that's another area where cross-disciplinary conversation is like really necessary.
So, but I mean, in an exchange society, don't you believe that incentives play a large factor in motivating people to behave in certain ways, right?
Yes, but I think that we should think about different ways to conceptualize why people do things and move away from the language of incentivizing. But I mean, that's sort of a side conversation. But yes, I think obviously there are incentives.
We should change it so that it isn't just driven by I think we have to change science ultimately at some point and everything else so that things aren't driven by these kinds of incentives. But that's a very long-term kind of project.
Wait, so can I just ask you to clarify?
That changing science and changing everything might be a wonderful stopping point.
I know. I was just going to say, so that's your answer to our question of how do we positively move away from these problems? Just change everything?
Well,
burn it down.
Yeah. No, not burn it down. Just rearrange it all completely. Maybe take it apart carefully and then rebuild it.
That's the heart of all the problems right there. Do we burn it down, or do we slowly rearrange and keep and preserve with the structure while we're trying to rearrange it?
Do we destroy capitalism, or do we form capitalism, or do
Hey,
we?
you're an always already podcaster now. You posed the question.
That's the only question, really.
That is the only question. Welcome to the room that we've all been sitting in forever. Now that we've reached the end of questions.
Ooh,
That was fun.
Yeah.
so fun.
We made friends across the aisle.
Yeah, very good.
Congratulations. We should all pat ourselves on our backs now.
Now we'll never talk to each other again, right?
It's funny because it's probably so true.
Should
Anyway.
we have some sort of wrap up or?
Thanks, Connor, for the initial idea to
Yeah,
bring
thank
us all
you.
together. That's
Yeah.
my wrap up.
Yeah,
I
thanks
agree.
for doing it, guys. It was fun.
So,
Yeah, this was a cool conversation.
Yeah.
Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast? Give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.